Fuga dalla realtà per chi ascolta, ma soprattutto guarda, lasciandosi certo incantare dalla musica, ma forse anche con la propria emotività irrimediabilmente dominata da un inconfessabile desiderio di identificazione nel gesto del direttore d'orchestra. Gesto che viene percepito, seppure per lo spazio limitato di una prova o di un concerto, come una sorta di sovrannaturale espressione del potere. Elias Canetti, autore profondamente avverso all'autoritarismo, scrisse: «I suoi occhi tengono soggiogata l'intera orchestra. Ogni esecutore ha la sensazione che il direttore lo veda personalmente, ma soprattutto lo senta. Egli è nella mente di ogni suonatore, non soltanto sa ciò che deve fare ciascuno, ma sa ciò che sta facendo. È l'incarnazione della legge positiva e negativa. Le sue mani decretano e proibiscono. E poiché durante l'esecuzione della musica non deve esistere altro che questa attività, per quel tempo il direttore è il padrone del mondo».
Fu la forza del destino a portare Toscanini negli Stati Uniti alla fine degli anni 30. E lui non fu l'unico europeo ad affrontare la traversata. L'unione di elementi del vecchio e del nuovo mondo si dimostrò potente.
I set out to build an orchestra which would combine the best qualities of the fine European orchestras pre-war period, even pre-First World War period, with the finest qualities of the American orchestras in their best period. That is the impeccable intonation, the impeccable virtuosity, the brilliance, the smoothness of execution, which very often in America was an end in itself.
Toscanini si stabilì a New York, dove lavorò con due grandi orchestre, la New York Philharmonic e la NBC Symphony. La NBC Orchestra, creata appositamente per lui nel 1937, fu il diretto risultato del fiorire dell'industria televisiva. La rivoluzione tecnologica nel campo televisivo e in quello delle registrazioni fece in modo che la musica potesse raggiungere le masse. L'abilità di Toscanini nell'articolare i suoni e il suo stile incisivo lo aiutarono a comunicare il messaggio della musica a milioni di nuovi ascoltatori in tutta la nazione.
In those days, more cultivated days, the New York Philharmonic was broadcast every Sunday throughout the nation. Toscanini conducting, and there was no television, of course, in those days. And that was the great cultural event that fashioned the musical audiences of that time in the whole of the United States. And I remember listening to a broadcast of his with my father somewhere on tour in Colorado. We were in a car, and that unmistakable Toscanini stamp was on it. It had naturally pace, precision, incision, everything was as sharply defined as you could possibly imagine. That was his greatness.
He had a wonderful imagination, how things should be. That's what I started to you. That he so vividly, even a shouting at a sforzato or a piano impression, he was an absolute 200% musician. And you could like or dislike what he did, but the personality was tremendous. He was a conductor very much typically a product of the late 19th century, early 20th century. He was a dictator in the best or the worst sense of the word, which wouldn't be possible today. He couldn't shout a single musician. That wouldn't go, but there's no need today.
Toscanini was very much the disciplinarian, and I would say, instead of being an autocrat, he was more a dictator with the orchestra. But they had immense respect for him, and immense love and affection, and it was a marvelous orchestra. So that between his autocratic or dictatorial ways and their love and affection for him, they got along fairly well. Only occasionally would there be one of those famous temperamental outbursts on his part.
Piano piano, stringendo, contrabbassi, formi e corte note, short note, so, sembrano dei carri, non sono mica strumenti, oh Madonna Santissima, short note.
He had no interest in the technical side of recording, and Toscanini always just expected to hear on the finished product what he heard standing in front of the orchestra. And of course, in those early days, that wasn't always possible because of the limitations of his huge dynamic range. We were recording once one of the Respighi tone poems, and when he came up to listen to it, he felt the climaxes weren't loud enough. And the engineer said, but Maestro, if we make it any louder, it will break the equipment. And he said, break the equipment then.
artist does thousands of things for which we have no method of writing on paper. We don't know how to do that. And we have to, through imagination, through feeling, through I don't know what, some instinctive quality that some artists have, we have to try to understand and reproduce and give to the listening public what we consider was in the eye, mind and soul of the composer.
Leopold Stokowski nacque a Londra, ma il suo accento non aveva una precisa connotazione. Anch'esso faceva parte della sua naturale inclinazione a farsi pubblicità, che a volte distolse l'attenzione dal suo grande talento. Era un esperto direttore e riusciva a tirar fuori da ogni orchestra quello che passò alla storia come il suono Stokowski. Era un suono ricco e pieno, che il direttore era riuscito ad ottenere nei 20 anni di lavoro con la Philadelphia Orchestra.
He compelled people to watch him, because virtually not a question of not one bar is in the same tempo from the next bar, but there's not one beat is in the same tempo. And to stay together, the orchestra had to be hanging on that finger or that hand, like somebody trying to climb a mountain. With the orchestra with him that way, he was able to control incredibly small things within beats. People always say that Stokowski had very vague gestures. They weren't vague at all. If one looks very carefully, he gives, although it's very expansive, there's a very small and controlled beat usually, and big dynamics are indicated with you'd have to be an idiot not to see what he wanted. But then it's what he does with tempo that's extraordinary, and that's where the control comes in. You can only do that, I think, if the player isn't worrying about, well, I have to be at this point of the bow going up. Stokowski just said, okay, you play where it's comfortable for you.
The flute has a solo. Instead of my conducting him, I follow him. I notice how he likes to phrase. Same with the oboe, the clarinet, or the horn, or whatever is a solo instrument. Now, with the strings, I like the feeling of the violin that sounds like a voice singing, to give it what we call cantabile in music. This singing quality is a beautiful thing. You have to give them a little freedom and breadth to do that, and I admit I do that.
I gesti drammatici e ampi che usava per dare alla musica un senso di libertà e respiro erano perfetti per l'atmosfera romantica di Hollywood. Stocky amava la notorietà e non fu restio a usare Hollywood per guadagnarsela.
A lot of people still today look upon him as a charlatan, but he was a musician right through and through, and he knew exactly how to present himself to the world. But when it came to conducting, I still think there was no one before him or since who knew how to make an orchestra sound. You might not have agreed with the sound. It was terribly lush and sometimes perverse, but it certainly ravished your ear.
It wasn't charlatanry. He really did believe in it. He believed that the huge sort of Victorian organ sounds that he got in the Bach the toccata and fugue were justified. And when you listen to it, it's a terribly exciting sound.
Some conductors had techniques that were at best difficult to determine. Kusevitsky, for example, was a marvelous conductor, but completely by the power of his personality. And he did it in rehearsal, searching for ways to make the orchestra reach for something that he could not explain in words. And he screamed and yelled and cajoled in English, Russian, and French until he got what he wanted.
Sergej Kusevitsky fuggì in Europa dopo la rivoluzione russa del 1917. Poi nel 1924 si spostò ancora più ad ovest, quando fu nominato direttore della Boston Symphony, proprio come la NBC Orchestra era di Toscanini e la Philadelphia era stata di Stokowski. Per i 25 anni seguenti la Boston Orchestra fu sua. Nel 1940 Kusevitsky fondò una scuola estiva di musica a Tanglewood, in Massachusetts. Uno dei suoi primi studenti fu il giovane Leonard Bernstein. Tra gli allievi di quella scuola, florida ancora oggi, ricordiamo Claudio Abbado e Seiji Ozawa.
Developments in creative music making have always come at places where there is a cross-confluence of different traditions meeting. And that happened in America in the 40s. The great American conductors are in fact the great European conductors. They all left. Like the great European composers, Stravinsky, Schoenberg, etc., mostly left. Furtwängler was one of the very few who stayed behind. And I think that, for example, Reiner and Zell were both protégés of Strauss. I mean, that is the legacy of Richard Strauss, that kind of conducting in many ways. Kusevitsky is a law unto himself. But, I mean, for the young American conductor, and I'm not just talking about Bernstein, but I mean of a whole generation, to have a tradition, a cross-fertilization possible of that kind of richness.
L'abbraccio di Hollywood alla nuova impronta culturale che gli europei avevano portato con sé arrivò al punto di convincere il severo Fritz Reiner a comparire in un film con il violinista Jascha Heifetz.
Fritz Reiner was one of the most brilliant stick technicians that I ever heard or saw. He had the orchestra at the tip of his baton, and he used a baton about this long, and he would just gently, and then he would do the tiniest of motions, and then look at them and say, "Why don't you follow me?" There are many stories about him, but there are legion. But the man was an absolute master of every single moment when he was on that podium. He knew it all. It was all in his head, his ears, and his eyes looked. Now, any good conductor will tell you, as Reiner did very often, they use their eyes most intelligently. It's the eye as much as the hand. They're looking at the orchestra, they're looking at the men, seeing, are they watching the conductor, are they looking at the score? But at some moment, simply by looking, they make the musician look at them, and there's an eye contact. The musician knows that the conductor knows what's going on in his mind at that moment.
Quando assunse la direzione della Chicago Symphony Orchestra nel 1933, Reiner alzò i suoi standard a un livello tecnico e musicale inimmaginabile. L'orchestra diventò una delle più grandi che il mondo avesse mai ascoltato, ma Reiner non assunse mai un atteggiamento da star.
He was not a man of sentiment or sentimentality. The same time he once recorded The Dance of the Seven Veils, and Mrs. Reiner, who was always present, said to me, "Don't you think he should schmaltz it up more?" And I said, "Well, you know, depends." I said, "I'm sure he won't." So when he came down here to playback, I was the one elected to brave the lion, and I said, "Dr. Reiner, it's a marvelous thing. There's no editing involved. Would you want to do it once more, just to make it a little more sensuous, a little more schmaltzy?" And he said, "No." And that was the end of that.
body motion, he got the most out of any orchestra. And if you talk to other musicians who played under Fritz Reiner, there was nobody who knew the score better than Fritz Reiner. He was flawless. All he had to do was just look at you. If a horn player made a mistake, he would just look at him. Or if somebody came in wrong.
Talking about Reiner or Zell, and to a certain extent Koussevitzky, although that's a different animal, you're talking about people who are at the helms of some of the greatest orchestras the world has ever seen, and orchestras that were capable of doing anything. And in the case of several of them, in fact, of all three of their orchestras, still are capable of doing anything. If you conduct an orchestra like the Cleveland and something goes wrong, it's the conductor's fault. It's not the orchestra's fault.
It's the Bell Telephone Hour. Tonight from Cleveland,
A Cleveland, George Szell poté realizzare il suo grande sogno di fondere le tradizioni orchestrali europee con quelle americane.
You play it now absolutely 100% rhythmically, this pa-pam, pa-pam, pa-pa-dam, but at the same time it has a little bit of pedantry about it. Couldn't we just make pa-pam, pa-pam, pa-pa, not too much space, not demonstrating how rhythmically we are playing it, just naturally, pa-pam, with a little more resilience to it. Before C, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Third and fourth horn with it, pa-pa-pam, coming in good time and preparing a good crescendo. Shadows, long form, long, almost a little too long form.
Il suo rigore durante le prove gli valse la fama non del tutto immeritata di essere estremamente duro.
I didn't sack many. You see, the Cleveland Orchestra was financially always very well endowed, so I could proceed with due regard to certain human considerations and could do it in a milder way. But there were, of course, moments of heartbreak and moments of unpleasantness. But then, of course, you arrive very soon at a point, and this point is now very much at discussion. What is the purpose of a symphony orchestra for which so many people give, without compensation, their time, I'm now talking about the board, and collect money? That's the way American orchestras are being run. As you know, there's no state or public money, just private money. What is the purpose? Is it the purpose of the symphony orchestra to make it possible to have the best of music, or is it the purpose of such an orchestra to give their members the easiest and unchallengeably permanent job?
No vanishing acts, please. F. Even more F. Don't sustain a lump of sound, sustain a dotted half note with a pulse of each quarter inside it. Then you know when to go on.
George Zell knew how the oboe breathed, so he would breathe with it. He knew how to give the oboe time to prepare the breath. He was a pianist and played wonderfully, but he bowed his scores for the string players. Some of them were funny at the time, but they worked musically. He knew how to create the effect that he wanted with an up bow or a separate figure or a legato, whatever the case may be. He knew exactly what he wanted to hear, the kind of articulation or the kind of singing sound that he wanted given that composition, that place. And this is something that the orchestra musicians want to know. It has to be a little bit more sarcastic.
We play with many conductors. Once in one season we played Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and we had to play 3 different ways. That's being professional. So when you play long notes, you're going like this, and the next conductor says, "What are you playing such long notes for? Play it shorter." You have to change like a chameleon and do it, and still retain your own orchestral ensemble.
Horns just a shade late, some of the horns. You must be prepared way ahead of time. I can't do better than to repeat this truism I think I said yesterday. Rests aren't there to rest, but to be braced for the next entry, to prepare and to be ready for it and to listen what's going on around you and to bring your next entry in so it makes sense and connects. To be ready with your breath, with your embouchure, everything, and with your general attitude. Resolution, alive. Suspense, no crescendo. Suspense, quick crescendo yet. Più. Più. one piano, two, then one forte and two fortes.
Nel frattempo un giovane leone stava conquistando le sale da concerto e quelle di registrazione di tutta Europa. Nel 1954 Herbert von Karajan sostituì Furtwängler come direttore dei Berliner Philharmoniker. La sua carriera partì come un razzo, alimentata dal suo smisurato ego e dall'uso senza remore di un nuovo mass media, la televisione. Mentre alcuni lo ammiravano, altri criticavano il suo approccio alla vita e alla musica.
Und das konnte die 100. Aufführung sein. Die war noch genauso faszinierend wie die erste. Denn er brauchte sich, er sah sich so als Mittelpunkt und musste da entsprechend sich engagieren für sich selber, für seine Karriere.
I confidently feel that for the greater part of public who has never been in a concert hall, they will get the idea. We've made some very queer experiences. First of all, in this time I was with my orchestra in Berlin in Japan. And last time we have been there was just one concert televised for people who were invited. This time every concert was televised. We have 18 concerts. And the estimate is that 25 million people watch these concerts. There is no getting around the fact this is the future and this is our times. And today it's maybe 25 millions. In 3 years, when we will do the thing from the concert, there will be 200 millions.
Karajan war der Erste, völlig anders. Er war nicht auf der Herstellerseite, sondern er war der fantastische Verkäufer. Nicht? Er verkaufte die Musik und er verkaufte sich, er verkaufte uns mit und das passt in unsere heutige Zeit. Nicht? Und deshalb, das hatten wir gespürt und deshalb wollten wir ihn auch haben. Nicht? Weil wir ganz deutlich wussten, wir haben jetzt damals unendlich viel Schönes kennengelernt. Auch Karajan wollte dieses Orchester haben, weil dieses Orchester den Klang Furtwänglers in sich trug.
Something like, you know, the bird which is flying over the I don't know, city or the world, because if we are inside, then we see the limit to see. And I always thought, my God, this man, he is over us. He see much further and much wider, because he had always fantastic ideas, universal ideas.
I got the impression in the concerts that I attended of Karajan towards the end of his life that there was something almost evil in the way that he exerted the power, and that was to the detriment of the music, that there were no surprises, there were no moments of joy. One felt that it was to a formula. Everything was self-regarding, that everything came back to himself.
Für uns war die erste Zeit nicht leicht, denn Furtwängler hatte uns flehentlich angeschaut und er hatte sich mit uns auseinandergesetzt. Und jetzt plötzlich wurden wir keines Blickes mehr gewürdigt. Nicht? Die Augen waren geschlossen und er stand dann so vorn und dabei nun diese glutvolle Musik dagegen setzen, nicht? Wenn man nicht angesprochen wird von dem Partner. Das war im Anfang sehr schwierig für uns. Später haben wir dann uns immer mehr aufeinander eingestellt. Karajan sich auf das Orchester und das Orchester auf ihn, sodass wir dann damit umgehen konnten.
No, that's not right. It's not enough. You must, I mean, please, almost no bow. I mean, just like breathing on the string, but an enormous left hand. I know it goes against your grain as a solo violinist to do that, but you must, to get this sonority of voices. It's got to be singing. It can't be just string playing.
A huge proportion of what's necessary is simply a giant personality and the ability to be an extraordinary psychologist. Not by studying psychology at a university or something, but just by simply knowing the animal that you're dealing with so well that they know that there's no point in them resisting.
Uno dei mentori di Leonard Bernstein era stato Bruno Walter. Walter aveva studiato con Gustav Mahler. Quando Bernstein, il primo direttore d'orchestra americano di statura internazionale, eseguì Mahler con i Wiener Philharmoniker, fu come un ritorno a casa.
He was a fantastic musician. And when he conducted the concerts and even rehearsals, I remember when I studied in Vienna, I heard his concerts and record sessions and rehearsals. He gave so much. He was really, he dedicated himself from, you know, all body. He dedicated everything for music.
There was a natural eruption of creativity in Lenny that spilled over into his interpretive and performing habits. He was not to everybody's taste always, and he did tend to overgild the lily once in a while, but so wonderfully and so gloriously. He gave of himself, and he created this wonderful palace of sound and ideas and emotion, sheer emotion.
There was somebody who had a more of the physical energy of rhythm in his body, in his little finger, than any conductor I've ever seen before or since. I mean, it was not just that he danced on the platform in a way that was unpalatable to many people, but didn't worry me, because it seemed to me that he was not trying to say, look at me, I'm having a wonderful time, but he just couldn't prevent it. It was as natural to him as swimming. And he had this extraordinary ability to make the players go along with that rhythmical current.
Precisi o flessibili, ridondanti o contenuti, lo scopo era lo stesso per tutti, fare da anello di collegamento fra l'ascoltatore e la musica.
If we ask what is it that music communicates to us, it's like all great art that every human being is alone in a sense that he's locked up in the isolation of his own mind. And then you hear a piece of music and you feel he too has been through this. And it's almost as if the musician is saying to you, you're not alone, I am with you.